You need to understand what happened to me because I still wake up some mornings and have to remind myself it was real. For 43 years, I was the kind of woman who kept everything running quietly. The meals, the appointments, the birthday cards sent on time, the house clean enough that no one ever had to think about it. I was a retired elementary school teacher from Guelph, Ontario, and I had spent my whole life believing that if you loved people well enough, they would love you back the same way. My husband passed in the spring. April, 3 years ago now. We had been married for 41 years. He was a gentleman, the kind who fixed things without being asked, and left notes in my coat pocket before work. When he died of a heart attack at 67, I didn't fall apart the way I thought I would. I just went quiet. The way a house goes quiet when someone leaves and doesn't come back. My daughter and her husband moved in with me 2 months later. That was their idea. They said they were worried about me being alone. They said it made more sense financially, that housing in the GTA had become impossible, that it was temporary. Just until they got back on their feet. My daughter's name doesn't matter here. What matters is that she had my eyes and her father's stubbornness, and I had spent 34 years thinking that meant she would turn out all right. Her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law because that is all he ever really was to me. Worked in sales. He was the kind of man who talked over women in a room and thought he was being charming. But my daughter loved him, and I told myself that was enough reason for me to try. The first year was manageable. I cooked, I cleaned, I stayed out of their way in the evenings. I babysat when they needed me to, which was most weekends. I told myself this was what family looked like, that I was lucky to have people around me after losing my husband. The second year, things started to shift. It was small things at first. My son-in-law began calling the upstairs bedroom my bedroom, the room where I had slept for 22 years, the spare room. He said it casually, the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time. My daughter started repeating his phrases. The house started feeling like a place I was visiting. Then one Sunday afternoon in February, they sat me down at the kitchen table. My own kitchen table, with the scratch on the corner where my grandson had dragged a toy truck across it when he was 3. My son-in-law did most of the talking. He said they had been thinking about the future. He said the house was worth quite a bit now. And he wasn't wrong. Property values in Guelph had climbed steadily, and that it would make more sense for them to have it properly in their names. He said, I would be more comfortable somewhere smaller. Easier to manage. He actually used the word manageable, as if I were a problem to be organized. My daughter sat beside him and didn't look at me directly. I asked what they meant. Exactly. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a transfer of title. They wanted me to sign the house over to them. He said they would make sure I was taken care of. He said there was a very nice seniors' residence on the edge of town. I was 66 years old. I was not confused. I was not frail. I had just finished marking a stack of literacy workbooks I was helping a neighbor's child with. And I had shoveled the front walk that morning before either of them was awake. But sitting at that table with that paper in front of me and my daughter studying her fingernails, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Completely invisible. I told them I needed time to think. That night I sat in the bedroom they called the spare room, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about my husband. He had been a careful man, quiet with money the way he was quiet about everything, not secretive, just private. He didn't believe in waste or in showing off. When we bought the house in 1987, He had insisted both our names go on the deed, even though at the time I was on maternity leave, and it would have been simpler to put it in his name alone. He just said, "It should be yours too." I had forgotten about that for a long time, because I had never thought I would need to remember it. I called a lawyer the next morning. A woman I found through the Law Society of Ontario's referral service, a real estate and family law specialist with an office on Woolwich Street. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. Then she asked me a question I hadn't thought to ask myself. Had I ever looked at the original deed recently? I hadn't. It was in the filing cabinet in the basement, in a green folder my husband had labeled in his neat, square handwriting. I found it that afternoon while my daughter was at work and my son-in-law was out somewhere. I sat on the basement floor in my cardigan and I opened it. My name was still on the title. Both our names, my husband's and mine, as joint tenants, which meant, our lawyer explained later, that when he died, the property had passed to me automatically, entirely. There was nothing to sign over. The house was already mine, completely and legally, and had been since the day he died. I don't know if my son-in-law understood that and was hoping I didn't, or if he simply hadn't done the research. It didn't matter much either way. What I did next surprised even me. I didn't confront them. I didn't wave the deed in their faces. I went upstairs, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table alone, and thought very carefully about what kind of woman I wanted to be. At this point in my life, I had spent 43 years being accommodating. I had been the person who kept the peace, who smoothed things over, who said it's fine when it wasn't always fine. I didn't want to do that anymore. But I also didn't want to become hard. I had seen what bitterness did to women who had been wronged. I didn't want that either. So I made a plan. I have a sister-in-law, my husband's younger sister, who lives in Burlington. She had been wanting me to visit for months. I called her that evening and said I was thinking of staying for a while. She said, "Come whenever you want," and I could hear in her voice that she understood something had happened, even though I hadn't explained yet. I also, quietly, called my financial advisor. My husband and I had built up a modest portfolio over the years. Nothing dramatic but steady. TFSAs, some GICs, a small self-directed RRSP that my husband had tended to carefully. My advisor had been suggesting for 2 years that I consider moving some of the longer-term holdings, and we had a conversation I should have had much sooner. By the time it was done, I had a clearer picture of what I actually had than I'd had in years. It was not a penthouse-level fortune, but it was enough. Enough for me to make choices. The other thing I did was go through the rest of the green folder. There were 4 envelopes inside that I had never opened. They were sealed, and on the outside of each one my husband had written, in that same neat handwriting, "For Eleanor, if needed." My name. My full name, Eleanor June Marsh, which he only used when something was serious. I sat at the kitchen table at midnight and opened them one by one. The first contained a handwritten letter. It was dated 8 months before he died, which told me he had known, or at least suspected, that something was coming. He didn't say that exactly. He just wrote that he wanted me to know where everything was. He listed accounts, policies, a safety deposit box at the TD branch on Stone Road that I had completely forgotten existed. He wrote, and I had to stop and take a breath when I read this. He wrote that he had always worried about me being looked after, not because he didn't trust me to look after myself, but because he knew I had a tendency to put everyone else first and leave myself last. He said he hoped I would let myself be looked after for once. By him, even at a distance. The other envelopes held documents. There was a small life insurance policy I hadn't known about, not enormous, but meaningful. There was the safety deposit box key. There was a note about a small investment in a family friend's property development that had apparently matured and been sitting in a trust account, waiting for me to claim it. And there was a letter from his own lawyer, dated the same month as everything else, outlining all of it in plain language with a phone number and a name. I sat there for a long time. Then I dried my face, went upstairs, and started making plans. I moved to Burlington in March. I told my daughter and her husband that I was going to stay with my sister-in-law for a while, that I needed time after everything, which was true enough. I didn't tell them about the documents. I didn't tell them about any of it. I just packed what I needed, arranged for my mail to be forwarded, and left. The next several months were the quietest I had felt in years. My sister-in-law had a spare bedroom that looked out over a garden, and she made coffee every morning and left it on the counter and didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I spent a lot of time walking. I called a grief counselor, which I should have done much sooner after losing my husband. I started sleeping properly for the first time in years. I also worked with my lawyer and financial advisor to get everything organized. The insurance policy paid out without difficulty. The trust account took a little longer to untangle, but it came through. I claimed everything my husband had left for me, quietly and without drama, the way he had always done things. By late summer, I had made a decision about the house. I was not going to sell it, not because I wanted to go back to living there. I didn't, or at least not yet, but because it was mine and I was not going to give it away. I contacted a property management company and arranged for it to be rented. The rental income was steady and the tenants were a young couple, a nurse and a teacher, who treated the place well. I found an apartment for myself in Burlington. Second floor of a converted Victorian house with tall windows and original hardwood and a small balcony where I kept a container of herbs in the summer. It was the first space that was entirely mine, not the family home, not a spare room, not somewhere I was making myself smaller to fit. Just mine. My daughter called in September. She said they had come by the Guelph house and found strangers living there. She asked what was going on. Her voice had a tone in it that I recognized, the one she used when she was preparing to manage me. I told her, calmly, that I had decided to rent the house for now, that I was living in Burlington, that I was well. There was a silence. Then she said, and this is the part that still makes me press my lips together when I think about it. She said, Mom, we made plans based on that house. I said, I know. She said, we were counting on things. I said, I understand that you were. And then I said, I need you to understand that I wasn't consulted about any of those plans, and I'm not responsible for expectations that were formed without my knowledge or agreement. Another silence, longer. She said they wanted to meet. She said my son-in-law wanted to apologize. She said they had been under a lot of pressure and hadn't handled things well. I told her I was willing to meet, but not yet. I needed more time, and that was not a negotiation. She called twice more in October. I called her back each time, which I want to be clear about. I was never trying to punish her. She is my daughter. I love her with the particular exhausting love that only mothers understand, the kind that doesn't switch off no matter what. But loving someone does not mean arranging your life around their comfort at the expense of your own. That had taken me 66 years to really believe, and I was not going to unlearn it now. We met in November, at a coffee shop in Cambridge that was equidistant between us. She came without her husband, which I appreciated. She looked tired. She ordered tea and then didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the cup. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without conditions attached, which I had not been expecting. She said she didn't know how she had let things go so far, that she had known something was wrong and had told herself it wasn't. She said her father would have been ashamed of her, and then she started crying. I didn't cry. I had done my crying alone over the previous months in the proper place for it. I told her I accepted her apology. I told her I wanted a relationship with her and with my grandchildren, but I also told her what I needed, specifically. The way my lawyer had helped me think through, the way I had never thought through before, because I had always assumed love was self-explanatory, and people who loved you would know what you needed without being told. I told her that my home, whatever form it took, was mine alone to decide about. That I would not be discussed as though I were an asset or a liability. That if her husband wanted a relationship with me, he would need to demonstrate that over time, not announce it. She nodded. She said she understood. She said she would talk to him. I don't know how their marriage will navigate what happened. That is not mine to manage. What I know is that my granddaughter came to stay with me in Burlington for a weekend in January, and we made butter tarts from scratch and watched old episodes of Schitt's Creek wrapped in blankets on my second-hand sofa, and she fell asleep against my shoulder. And I thought, this is what I was protecting. This, not a property value or a title deed or a bank balance. This ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable thing. My husband left me more than I knew. He left me money I hadn't tracked and documents I hadn't read. And a letter that said, in his plain way, that he trusted me to look after myself if it came to that. I am still learning how to do that. But I am learning. I stood on my balcony this past March, on the 1-year mark of when I left Guelph, and it was the first mild day after a long winter. That particular late March cold softening just slightly, the way it does in southern Ontario before it's really ready to commit to spring. I had coffee. I had nowhere to be. I had made no plans to fit around anyone else's schedule. My husband used to say that some things take time to show their value. He was talking about investments, mostly. But standing there, in a space that was entirely my own, I thought he probably meant more than that. Some things do take time, and some things, it turns out, were always yours. You just had to stop giving them away long enough to notice.